Anybody else wants to sit down? Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming out on this semi-wet afternoon in March. I'm Lisa Garcia-Bedoya, and welcome to the Center for Latino Policy Research's speaker series. Today we are honored to have Professors Aida Hurtado and Pedro Noguera to talk about their forthcoming book, Understanding the Disenfranchisement of Latino Males. I'd like to begin by thanking our co-sponsors for this event, the Haas Diversity Research Center Education Policy Cluster, the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues, the Graduate School of Education, and the Center for Race and Gender. I'd also like to thank my staff that made today possible, in particular Christina Lash, who's our Director of Public Programming in the back, Rosa Rodriguez, Chinghua Chu, who does all of our beautiful flyers and makes sure that our technology works, Alejandro Jimenez, and Stephanie Cuevas. I'd like to ask all of you, there's a sign-in sheet to the right of the door. When you're stepping out, if you wouldn't mind signing in before you leave, the university asks us to do this, so if you could be so kind, I would greatly appreciate it. So right now I have the opportunity to introduce our introducer. We do this in the academy, it's sort of silly, but there you go. Professor Alex Zaragoza is an associate professor of Chicano Latino Studies here at Berkeley. He was actually my honors thesis advisor when I was an undergraduate here, so I have a long-term relationship with him and direct experience with the mentorship and support he has provided to students on the Berkeley campus for not that long, for a while. Alex received his PhD from the University of California, San Diego. His research looks at the historical interface between processes of racialization and inequity in Latin America, especially Mexico and Cuba, and their intersection with immigration to the United States, a topic very important in our current day. He's the author of 3 books and numerous articles. The books include The Monterrey Elite and the Mexican State. Okay. He's written a lot, how about that? And we're very happy to have him here today.
Thank you, Lisa. I was her kindergarten teacher. No visible damage. First, I want to thank the Center for organizing this event, and Lisa, you in particular, for having the vision to put this event together. I wanted to have just 2 minutes. That's all I want to take. First, Aida, where are you? Oh, there. So you were standing all that time. It's not only a pleasure, but really an honor to introduce our 2 key presenters today. On the one hand, their work is in many respects really important, because for a long time there was an implicit and sometimes almost an explicit neglect of gendering the situation of Latinos in the United States. Anyone who works with students, though, whether it's in outreach, recruitment, and so on, knows the distinctions that occur between Latino men and Latino women, whether it's in the form of incarceration rates, whether it's in the form of academic achievement in the schools or lack thereof, whether it's in participation in California Youth Authority, to take the case of California specifically, etc. So because of that, this collection of essays is in fact a real turning point in how we think about gender and Latinos in the United States. The other reason why I'm very honored to be here is we have a very small number of real warriors in the academy, people who have always given of themselves for the welfare and concern of Latinos in general, Latino children in particular. Whether it's Chris Gutierrez at UCLA, Jean Garcia in Arizona, now at NYU, Jeannie Oakes, and we could go on and give other names here. But in fact, it's a small number of people. And we have 2 of the greatest warriors in that respect with us today, Pedro Noguera and Aida Hurtado. And I suspect their presentations will only add to the laurels, but more importantly to their commitment to the concerns of low-income, underrepresented children more broadly, but particularly to the concerns that I suspect many of us, if not all of us, have about the future of a state like California and its thousands of Latino young men and women and boys in particular, whose future is at best suspect. So again, my great pleasure to introduce is Aida first. Pedro Noguera, and then Aida Hurtado. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here, to see so many familiar faces from different parts of my Berkeley life. Having been here for almost 20 years, you have lots of connections, and so lots of connections out here in the audience. I want to thank all of you for coming out today, including the ones that I don't know. And just say that I often feel bad about Berkeley, because the severe cuts you're going through right now, we're all of California, but I still have a warm place in my heart for this place, and even this room brings up lots of memories. So thanks for being here. We're going to talk about this book and the project itself, what we were trying to accomplish. I want to say that first time that I've worked with Aida on a project like this, and what a special opportunity that was, because we complement each other well, and we have another colleague who's not here, Eddie Fergus, who was also central to this process. But part of the reason why we complement each other is because Aida is much more detail-oriented than I am. And she could definitely catch lots of things that I would have missed. And so I really appreciate the fact that I had a colleague to work with like that. We took this project on. We received a grant from the Ford Foundation to study what we call the disenfranchisement of males of color. And we started with a meeting that brought together researchers, practitioners, and people in the policy world. And the focus of that meeting was to look at what works. We looked at high schools that had high graduation rates for males of color, criminal justice programs that were working at keeping young men who had been incarcerated out of prison again, employment programs that were working at getting young men especially into jobs and careers. And we looked at health programs. Those were the 4 areas that were also kind of cutting edge. And our question is, given that we know these programs work, and we really looked around the country to find examples of successful programs and interventions, then the question was, why can't we do more of what works? Right? And we figured we would bring together researchers who studied interventions and looked at replication, particularly as an area of focus, with the people who were involved in policy. We only focused on policymakers from New York and New Jersey because we figured let's start with these two. And I remember that one day, in the morning, I said, well, this is right. We've got all the right people in the room. We could actually do something very significant. Till I think it was after lunch that I realized, oh, this is a total mistake. Because policy is not made by research. Policy is made by politics. And we don't do what we do because it makes sense or because there's any evidence to support what we do. We do it because of ideology, because of political agendas. That's the reason why we have these policy problems on our hands to a large degree, and why we are not more able to replicate strategies that work. And so we thought maybe next time we need to get some elected officials in the room, if that might help. But one of the things we came away from was thinking that there definitely needed to be much more scholarship on Latino males in particular. Because what was clear as we did this scan was that there was just a dearth of scholarship. And that even the people who were doing the scholarship were not in conversation with each other. It was fragmented by discipline, fragmented by area of focus. And we felt that there was a real need to begin to pull that together, because here we had a segment of the population that clearly had tremendous needs and was in many ways deeply marginalized and disenfranchised, but at the same time, very little attention. And we thought that we needed to do something about that. And we went about it. We actually enlisted a couple of grad students and said, look, just scan the literature and identify who are the people who are studying Latino males in health, in education, in criminal justice, in labor market. And we then started to identify. So we didn't invite our friends, we identified the people who were doing the work, whoever they were. And that's how we ended up bringing together this collection, and we actually met together to talk about our work and to look at the connections. And one of the things that I think is most striking when you think about the challenges that face this segment of the population, Latino men, is first of all that the challenges come up in different areas and domains. Right? And that is that Latino men, on the one hand, males have some of the highest dropout rates of any group of students in the country. Right? African American males being the other group. Right? But also more likely to be suspended and expelled, more likely to be placed in special education, more likely, and again, depending on context, to be underachievers. But then at the same time, having parallels in the labor market. Latino males have higher employment rates than other groups, but more likely to be concentrated in low-wage jobs as a permanent, almost underclass labor force in the country. And then the health and the employment challenges, all pointing again to the fact there was something going on with this population, but that you couldn't just come up with one theory that would explain it all. Because the challenges really cut across race, class, and gender, and beyond that, there was incredible diversity within that Latino population. The challenges facing Cubans in Miami are not the same as the challenges facing Mexican immigrants in Texas or Puerto Rican and Dominicans in New York. That is that this is an incredibly diverse population with different needs, different issues. And so we felt that we could not produce a work that was just going to be totalizing in terms of its explanation. We had to really do the empirical work to try to, first of all, understand what was going on. And hence our call to the scholars who were doing the work. We also knew that we could not fall into the trap, and we've seen this trap elsewhere, of framing these men that we were looking at merely as victims. Because we knew that patriarchy as a cultural system is very much intact, not only in this country, but in Latino communities as well. Right? That is that men still have power. Men still occupy positions of dominance in families, in at least when they're present, in churches, in business, in politics. And so we didn't want to frame Latino males merely as victims in this, because we knew that there were many ways in which Latino men continue to enjoy privileges related specifically to gender, at least vis-a-vis Latinas, women. And so we knew that that couldn't be the way we looked at these issues. We also knew that some of what was happening to the Latino men we focused on was really profoundly about race and class. Because we knew that the structural changes that we'd seen occurring in the economy, the deindustrialization of urban areas, the ways in which men of all races, but who are working class, are increasingly disenfranchised. People have described the current recession that we're in as primarily a male, creating a shortage of jobs for men especially. Because working class men have been, in many cases, those who had jobs in the industrial sector, been some of the ones that have been the most hardest hit by unemployment, particularly those who haven't had education. And so we didn't want to, we wanted to understand how do the changes that are occurring in the society shape and influence the patterns of opportunities that Latino men in particular are experiencing. We wanted to make sure that we did, even though there's a tendency in some of this literature to kind of lump Black and Latino men together, we said we've got to try to disentangle that a bit to understand what's specific to the issues of Latino men, given that the fact that the labor market participation is so different for this group. And then we knew, too, that all of this work was occurring in the midst of a tremendous backlash against immigrants. That is in a political climate that is increasingly hostile, not just to the undocumented, because as many of us know that sometimes even within the same family, there are documented and undocumented people who are living in the same household, and that the way in which the laws are being drafted, particularly in Arizona, but not only Arizona, end up scapegoating a whole class of people, especially if they speak Spanish and are doing the work that Americans typically don't want to do. And so we wanted to make sure that the political climate was something we also took into account as we did this work, because that was shaping the way policymakers at local and state levels were responding to the needs. That is, if you don't believe these to be worthy people of being helped, then chances are you're not going to provide the help, much less the attention that's required. So we wanted to make sure that we took into account these different cultural and economic and political forces that would work as we framed and looked at the issues, at the same time avoided the trap of coming up with framing it around simple kind of dichotomies of victims or villains. And so while we drew on some of the work of earlier feminist scholars who had studied gender but who had focused largely for good reason on the concerns of women, we knew that we had to do something different when we gendered it and focused it on men. Because we had to understand both men in relation to women, but also men as a social category in a society where, for some reason, men are increasingly, and boys especially, of color, at great risk. We also knew that this is not simply an American phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon. That is that in many countries now, men are increasingly obsolete in the labor market, being outperformed in school education by women. And there are a lot of people wondering what is there about the way in which the economy is changing that somehow are men at a greater advantage or a disadvantage than women in this new economy. And there is speculation, but I think no real hard evidence. There are some who suggest that women are more likely to possess the soft skills that are more advantageous in the new economy than men have in the past. But we did think that there's something perhaps about the way in which masculinity gets constructed that might be contributing to the ways in which boys especially become alienated from school, begin to not see themselves as academically oriented, and that might compound some of the particular challenge that we were looking at. So all that to say that as we framed it, we dove into the complexity rather than trying to avoid it. We figured that complexity had to appear in the work because we knew that the issues we were looking at don't lend themselves to easy solutions, much less even easy analysis. And so we didn't try to go there. We also knew that part of what we were dealing with as we embarked on this work was a way in which Latinos as a group were seen as posing a threat, not just related to immigration, but related to demographics. That is that all the census projections are that by the year 2041, this country will be a nation where no ethnic group holds the majority. And Latinos are the fastest growing group. If we want to use the term ethnic, it's complicated how we categorize Latinos as a group in society. And Latinos are now appearing in places where Latinos never appeared before, like Tennessee and Georgia. And I saw the other day the least Latino state in the country. They said I think was it Wyoming. I forget which one they said had the least Latinos. Oh no, West Virginia. It was West Virginia. It's the only handful of burrito places in West Virginia. But the fact is that the Latinos are changing the landscape of this country. And it is evoking, I think, a response in many communities that is troubling, to say the least. We opened the book with a vignette of a group of workers who are waiting out in East Hampton, New York. East Hampton, one of the wealthiest communities in the United States, in the hot sun, along the side of the road, waiting for work. Day laborers who are there to do the dirty work of construction, of house cleaning, of cutting grass, and struck by the fact that on the one hand, they are so visible out in the open because they're just there on the side of the road, and on the other hand, now blended, they're almost like they're shrubs, like they blended into the environment. It's completely accepted, right? Except for Sundays when the anti-immigrants come out with American flags to protest against their presence. And we were struck by the fact that this kind of undifferentiated mass is not known, right? Rendered invisible despite the fact that they perform work that is so essential and central to the viability of that economy in that particular community. And we thought that part of what we had to do for this work is to make them no longer invisible, to understand who are Latino men, what are the particular challenges and issues they face. And that was what really drove this work, is to lift the veil, lift this sense of invisibility. So let me now turn it to my colleague Aida Hurtado, who's going to, I should show you some of the contributors and the chapters that are in the book. I won't read them because it's too small to see, but as I said before, they do come from a variety of disciplines. We looked at everything from the labor market to health to education, all with a desire to understand what is happening to Latino men in the United States today. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Aida.
Well, let me just start by saying I want you to note that we match our wardrobe. That's what happens when you start working together. And I also want to take the opportunity to publicly thank Pedro for including me in this project. I really was not part of the project initially. And although he's saying that it's because I'm detailed-oriented, believe me, my skills are not worth the trouble. So there was this amazing synchronicity in our thinking and conceptualization. And I have to say that of the many men I've worked with, Pedro's probably the easiest going. So I was telling people that Pedro and I are known for having 2-minute meetings and deciding 10 things. So we were able to get this book done very, very quickly in terms of as edited books go. And I think that the more that we talk about it, I have to admit that in the beginning as a feminist scholar, I didn't want to invest a lot of time studying men. But I've been converted, so you'll see in what I write now. I also will read a few of the contributors because I wore my glasses. So Isabel Valenzuela, you know him from UCLA, Edward Fergus, who's our co-editor, Meli Torres, who's one of Pedro's graduate students, Miguel Muñoz Lavoy, Craig Haney from UC Santa Cruz, Dolores Inés Casillas, Maria Felix Ortiz, Philip Cerrato, Daisy Diaz Strong, Horacio Roque Ramirez, Clara Rodriguez, Nancy Lopez, Naomi Way, James Diego Vigil, and Ramiro Martinez. And these are first authors, and then there's second and third authors. So just want to give them credit. The one thing I wanted to talk about before I give you a sample of one of the chapters is that we, in coming together as usual, I siempre hay pleito. There's always like a little, skirmish, and so many other times it's me that's starting it. And one of the concerns I had was that I didn't want the theoretical paradigm of victimhood to be flipped on its head. So all of a sudden, we have feminist scholarship that makes claims for women's position and oppression. So that I didn't want to be in a circle saying, well, the reason Latino men are doing so badly is because Latino women are doing so well. And so that you don't have that kind of flip in the analysis. And it's hard to do because that's probably the only thing we have available in the academy. And then, oddly enough, I went back to my feminist scholar mothers and found the solution, which is if you apply intersectional analysis that we've applied to women and that came out of Kimberly Cranshaw's work and other women of color's work, where it says it's not only gender, it's also race, class, sexuality, physical ableness, etc., that determines hierarchies in our society, then therefore these axis of oppression gives specificity to what it is that we're talking about. And so obviously that's what we also apply to to Latino men. And so that if we take the categories that confer power in our society, like race, sexuality, gender, ethnicity, etc., and that this is like an amoeba that changes from context to context. So in certain contexts, sexuality is more prominent, and that'll be what is used to objectify you. In other instances, it'll be ethnicity. In other instances, it'll be gender. So if you take this kind of very flexible approach and layered approach and intersectional approach, then one can then start seeing how these social identities converge to sort of give us insight as to why is it that possibly that Latino men are perhaps not doing so well. And also it allows us to look at within group differences, so that we don't look at Latinos as just one homogeneous category, but there are differences by sexuality, and as Pedro was indicating, there are geographical differences, there are differences in immigration status, etc., etc. And instead of that adding confusion, I think that adds insight. And so that's what I think we try to do here. And one of the things that I think is the only time I've ever wished that I was 20 years younger was when I think about the emerging scholarship that's now going to have to conceptualize what I'm beginning to think of is the disadvantages of privilege, right? Because we always think that privilege only confers privilege. And I think now with the studies on whiteness, for example, it's beginning to open up other apertures in a more nuanced way of what happens when you're not forced to confront certain limitations. That limited freedom in many ways can come back to bite you, as the young ones say. So we fully recognize male privilege, but there are other dimensions of difference that may simultaneously hold men of color back, and that's what we've not fully analyzed. So let me give you a sample of the co-author chapter that I have in the book with Professor Craig Haney, who's my legal partner, and my brother, who's a social worker, and who he himself has been in the criminal justice system and came out and now is doing therapy with kids and counseling with kids. And it was very interesting to, with Latino boys primarily. So it was very moving to do this chapter with my brother and hear his insights and how they informed my feminism and reconstructed it in many ways. The thing with any analysis of the educational pipeline among Latino men has to be tied to the criminal justice system. It's sort of the yin and yang for Latino men. It's almost like you can't study women and the condition of women without studying the right to control your body, right? So that everything emanates from that. And for Latinos, the interconnection is affects almost every single Latino man that you can talk to, and shortly I'll explain why. And I just want to say that this work, this interconnection between the educational pipeline and the prison pipeline is something that really was not generated by the old ones. The elders, I guess we should call myself. It was really generated by young scholars. And so I want to recognize them. Julie Figueroa, are you here? Okay, she was going to come from UC Davis. She just got tenured at Cal State Davis, and she's one of my... Sexting, I'm sorry. And she was my postdoc, and she was one of the first to start looking at this, and there's magnificent work by Luis Ponjuan, and his picture's there, and Victor Science, that happens when you have Facebook. And of course, I think some of the most crucial work, I think, and inspiring work, at least for me, is not by the not so young person, Pedro Noguera, and his life, so I didn't have to look at his book. But I think that this kind of work really embodies intersectionality. It's non-blaming. It's examining oppression within privilege, and it's doing all that exciting stuff that I laid out. The other thing that we talked about throughout in the book, especially Pedro talked about the policy recommendations we make, is that you really cannot look at the educational achievement of Latino boys and men without examining simultaneously macro and micro factors. And so that when you try to make it a dispositional analysis, It's just about men's masculinity. It's just about their, my favorite thing is when I hear people say, about their machismo. Something I don't even pronounce it right. As if men, Latino men were the only ones that dipped into patriarchy and took advantage of it. I think that's a very shallow analysis. And the dilemma or the puzzle is that the conditions that produce the underachievement of Latino boys are many times the exact conditions that allow Latina young women to succeed, and we can't explain it, right? So my family is a perfect example. My little sister's here who came to, was an undergraduate and a Bolt, graduate from Bolt Law School, and my other sister is an MSW, and my brother was in prison. And I think we were chastised and reprimanded more in our family than my brother ever was, and I'll show some research about that. So it's the exact same family producing completely different outcomes. Why, right? And so in order to have a meaningful account of these life trajectories, we have to intertwine the macro factors of poor schools, poor neighborhoods, not very good trained teachers, et cetera, with the micro factors that get manifested in everyday life. In terms of the macro factors, the things that we looked at in particular in this chapter is the criminalization of young men of color. That is that you're born a criminal unless otherwise proven, right? And I'll talk a little bit about how that's done. The poverty conditions of schools, undertrained teachers, and few outreach programs like Pedro was saying that were tailored specifically to young men are particularly non-existent. So that is intertwined with the micro factors. And I think the macro factors are pretty well documented. I think there's wonderful sociologists, incredible economists, all kinds of different things. I think the micro is a little bit more invisible, and that's something that Pedro and I have talked a lot about. And I've written with my colleague and former graduate student, Mirnal Singha. And one of the things that we found in the studies that we conducted, which we call the Latino masculinity study, was that we interviewed 105 Latino men, primarily in the Southwest. It's a non-random sample, and also in the East Coast, like Massachusetts, New York, and Washington. And it was a parallel study to my Chicana feminisms study, which meant that they were between the ages of 20 and 30. They were all in higher education, many times in very prestigious schools, Ivy Leagues. And we wanted to see really two parallel universes. And when I started out, I didn't know I was going to use the data to find out these micro differences in their everyday lives when these macro differences were held constant. So what we find is that a lot of the socialization of masculinity takes place in the home. So as Pedro was saying, and every group has its own version of masculinity that's very determined by their cultural practices. And so machismo exists in all cultures, but the particular cultural manifestation is very idiosyncratic or specific too. So when we get socialized in that cultural system, we don't see it, right? So we think of ourselves in the United States, especially if you're upper middle class, married to another professor, you don't think machismo is present. And if you really step outside of it, guess who picks up the kid at school? Guess who does the dishes? Guess who does the emotional work? Guess who answers the emails for dinner parties? Guess who picks up the clothes at the dry clean, et cetera, et cetera. And that seems trivial, but that's the enactment of gender, right? That's the enactment of patriarchy. And those of us that are in those situations, I'm not dissing my husband, he's great. You write with your left hand while your right hand is doing gender, right? And it's just invisible. So we point the finger at other cultures, we point the finger at other countries, because since we weren't socialized to accept it, we don't see it. We see it, okay? That's exactly the case in Latino families. so that the young women that I interviewed for very successful in school, you know, in Ivy League schools and PhD programs, some of you may be sitting in the audience, had restrictions, had curfews, were always monitored, had chores up the kazoo, right? In fact, you had to clean your brother's room while he slept. That was many of the vignettes. And the brothers in those families, including the men that we interviewed that were in Ivy League schools, et cetera, didn't have any of those things, okay? Had no restrictions, had no curfews, could date anybody they wanted, they could live with their girlfriends, and they weren't damaged merchandise, et cetera. And yet, they both succeeded educationally with very different kinds of socializations. So the other thing is that I want to shift now to examining only the men. And so what we find in these microdynamics is also the difference is that the way the state treats Latino women and Latino men. So that none of the women that I interviewed, the 101 Latino women, exact same age, exact same educational achievement, had ever been harassed by a policeman, had ever been picked up in any other very poor neighborhoods, have ever been in juvie, right? Whereas the men, the 101 Latino men that we consider our educational elite, were actually reported, 2/3 of them, 66% reported they had been harassed by the police, okay? And in many instances they wrote, when we asked them, have you ever been in prison or in jail? And several of them, or many of them actually wrote, not yet, right? So the expectation of harassment, the expectation of incarceration is just as viable as having a PhD or going to law school. It will happen with time. And I can give you some examples. So the respondents that not only had been harassed, but also expected harassment. And let me just give you some examples. Nikolas was a 23-year-old from Texas who had attended college and was working at a natural history museum in San Antonio at the time of the interview, and he described his relationship with the police as follows. I've been harassed more times than I can remember. As an adolescent, I was an easy target, being both brown and young. One tender recollection would be in San Antonio after a 12 a.m. curfew when I was pulled over with a group of friends. 2 police cars stopped us. Later, we were all standing hands against the cars and being thoroughly searched. My friendly officer thought he would amuse himself by tickling my nuts as he dug his hands into my pockets. He then gathered with the other cops as we waited, hands against the cars, forever, and for them to laugh about the whole thing. I don't think if anybody else was violated as such. I never asked. That's another big difference is men don't talk about their harassment. They don't talk. I mean, I was shocked when I read this because I had my stereotype that, you know, men just don't, you know, they like to be touched. The stupidity of that thought, you know. And this is a young person who may or may not be sexually experienced, but we have no discourse for that sexual vulnerability. And he had never told this incident to anybody except in our interview. The same thing goes with the 20-year-old junior, 20 years old, and I want to emphasize that. These are kids. You know, I call them young men, but they're not men. I mean, they're just young kids, a little bit out of adolescence. And he was talking about, he was majoring in English at a college in Boston, and he recalled being stopped by a policeman while driving with a group of friends from several prominent schools, including Tufts, Harvard, and Northeastern. We were stopped and harassed. My boy, for those of you that are not hip, friend, had a broken taillight, but the officer kept asking us where we were going, where were we coming from, where were we going to do we have anything in the car? I felt violated. I couldn't even speak. And the same thing happened with another MIT student, and when he identified himself as being from MIT, thinking that would protect him from harassment, He said, the officer refused to believe I went to school there and continued to badger me with stupid questions. So escaping all the vulnerabilities in a barrio, in an inner city, and succeeding, going to MIT, going to Harvard, even that doesn't protect you. So I think that this is something for us to think about. The other thing is that we want to think about interventions. And one of the things that we tried to do in the last chapter in the book is talk about micro and macro interventions. And I want to point out one intervention that we think is very important. If you guys saw Waiting for Superman, right? It's Jeffrey Canada's work, and I think that exemplifies a macro approach. And it's innovative and is sort of as accomplished as those kinds of innovations are. I think that they also have to be coupled with more one-to-one interactional innovations. And what we're trying to think about is Canada proposes this geographical zone. So his intervention is in a 100-block radius in Harlem. What we want to do is do what Michelle Fine talks about, creating micro-safe spaces. And she says these safe spaces can then, are intended to create pockets of possibilities. That if there was a place for this young man to go talk about being touched in his privates and feeling violated to another man and being affirmed that was not supposed to happen to me, that it doesn't mean anything about him, there's nowhere for him to go. You know, there's no rape center, there's no women's center. And I'm not saying that women have it easy, but we fought hard for those safe spaces, and there's no parallel discourse for men. And so that one of the things that we are also, it is difficult for me because I'm so anti-clinical psychology, but I do, seeing my brother's work, there's non-therapeutic counseling interventions that are social interventions and not necessarily head shrinking. Not that I'm not above head shrinking myself, but I think that this is a social problem, not a dispositional problem. And so I think we need new language to say, how do men help other men? So I know in my brother's work, he's 55 years old, he helps kids, they call him the homie counselor. And he goes to parks in Santa Cruz and talks to street kids and tries to get them back into school. That's the first time that many times that an adult male has ever talked to these kids in a nurturing, kind, supportive way, wanting the best for them. And that should not be the exception. And so to me, it really has made me start to think about innovative kinds of interventions that are interactional in nature, and they're led by men for men. And so I just want to end with these very hopeful graphics from interventions designed for kids in K through 12. And I'll let my colleague finish off with the last chapter where we make specific policy recommendations. Gracias.
So I will follow up on some of the policy recommendations that Aida was just speaking about, and I'll start with education. And we're going to speak about these more in terms of principles than specific policies, because we think that they're going to play out differently in different communities, and they can play out differently at local, state, or federal level. But I want to start with the idea of early intervention and in education. That is, all the research shows that if we can address the needs of children early, it is cost effective, it can profoundly shape the likelihood of them graduating or dropping out later on. I want to recommend now a colleague here, David Kerp, just published a book called Kids First, in which he outlines and describes many of these programs that are in place in different parts of the country already. When we intervene early with kids who are falling behind academically or who are getting into trouble, there's ample evidence that this works to make it less likely that they will slip through the cracks or get into more trouble later on. And it's always the case that early intervention works better than late intervention. A lot easier to teach someone to read in 3rd grade than in 9th grade. And when you see so many of these young people coming into high school, reading at the 3rd and 4th grade level, you have to ask, why did no one see this? Why was not something done much sooner to address the needs of these students? You see kids who are getting into trouble in school, and often for fairly minor infractions, as in elementary school. Why wasn't, again, a counselor, a caseworker, some sort of social support provided to these students to figure out, first of all, what are the needs, because it's typically needs that are driving behavior, and why didn't we find ways to address those needs earlier? Second principle is the idea that the intervention should be holistic and integrated, right? That is that we can't just focus on the educational issue if, in fact, what's driving it is a problem at home. Or a peer group issue, or if they're in high school, the fact that this student might feel great pressure to work. The number one reason for which immigrant students particularly will drop out of school is to work. Right? And so if we want to reduce dropouts, then we can't simply focus on what's happening in school, we have to focus on what's going to happen after school. And how do we integrate young people into the economy and into the workforce in ways that result in meaningful jobs and career paths. Aida talked about the Home Children's Zone, which I think is a great example of an integrated intervention strategy, though it is expensive and probably unreplicable. They have a $70 million endowment, about a $12 million annual budget. It's very hard to imagine how we could replicate that on a broader scale. We're trying to do something very similar in Newark, New Jersey right now, working with 7 schools in the Central Ward, but without the millions. We want a few million maybe but really relying on community resources to build a similar kind of safety network for children that would address both the social needs, the health needs, but also provide extended learning opportunities and other kinds of support for families. Because we think that it's very clear that if we only focus narrowly on one set of issues, like academic achievement, and ignore the others, that we will continue to repeat the patterns of failure. Third is that the interventions have to be evaluated regularly. We can't just be satisfied with funding programs. We have to study them and ask, do they work? Do they serve the kids that they were supposed to serve? What happens? Do the outcomes change? And if not, what needs to be done differently? That is that we have to combine research with this intervention, because too often what we've seen in the past is that programs, even programs that were set up for ostensibly good purposes, can become thwarted and distorted and become something altogether different. I often say that in many school districts, for example, Title I programs are largely employment programs. Right? That is, they employ people, but they're not necessarily effective at the intervention for which they were intended. And that, I think, calls attention to the need for regular evaluation. Third, we have to be sensitive to differences. Differences in age, differences in socioeconomic status, differerences in family status. That is that we need to tailor intervention to the particular needs of the groups and individuals that we're targeting. We're working right now in New York City to try to draw attention. We've done a study that showed Black and Latino males have a graduation rate of less than 30% in New York City. Right? But we also showed there are at least 20 high schools in New York City where they have graduation rates of over 90%. Right? And then the question is, what are they doing differently? Why aren't we doing more of what they do? Why aren't schools learning from each other? And borrowing on best practices, and are there differences? Why is it that some of those English language learners are learning English, in fact, in those schools, and ending up bilingual fully, and others are not? We need to make sure that when we design interventions, we study best practice, but we also adapt it to the particular circumstances of communities and schools. We need to also think about the individual level of system change. That is, how are individuals impacted by broader policy changes? And sometimes that doesn't happen. When I can think of many examples, particularly here in California, where we implemented policies that we thought would result in better outcomes. So, for example, for those of you who are old enough to remember, I see Norton Hill remember, Pete Wilson's lowering class size. Who could be against that? Lowering class size, except that they didn't remember or realize at the time, if you lower class size, you actually need to build more schools. You need to hire more teachers, because you actually create shortage, and what it ends up doing is, in many cases, creating a shortage of teachers in the poorest communities, because those teachers can get hired elsewhere. And so you need to think on the consequences of policy change and how that impacts different communities in different ways. And then we also need to look at the ways in which the policy interventions need to be combined with the kind of social support and emotional support that men increasingly need. There's interesting work coming out of a group at the University of Chicago on social and emotional learning. And one of the findings is that men are clearly developmentally disadvantaged compared to women in terms of social and emotional development, what Daniel Goleman calls social and emotional intelligence. And that these kinds of skills, it's interesting, David Brooks' new book talks, that's what it's mostly about, is the fact that we don't teach people how to demonstrate help-seeking behavior, for example. We don't teach people how to be mentored. We don't teach people how to express their feelings, how to talk about challenges and frustration. I often say that many men only feel comfortable expressing either anger or joy. Right? That leaves a whole lot of other emotions that are going to cause problems for young men, and if those help is not provided, it can be manifested in other ways that are more troubling. So those are the kind of basic principles. If we're in the questionnaire, we can give you more examples of where they're being applied, what we can learn from the places where we see success occurring. But I'll stop there, and maybe Aida and I can both come up now and take some questions. Oh, I have to warn you, I have to leave to Oakland, so I have about half an hour.
You should feel free, jump in, raise a hand. You guys are on your own.
Sure. Yes.
My name's Lois Korn, and I'm from New Jersey, so I'm really curious about the program in Newark because I absolutely the mayor was only in some Facebook money, whatever else. So what's that looking like?
Well, we actually got started in Newark before the Facebook money. I often say the Facebook money is a little bit, you ever know a family that gets an inheritance and then everybody starts fighting with each other? Well, unfortunately, that's happened in Newark. Everybody's fighting over what's going to happen with this $100 million. We are kind of ignoring the $100 million and focusing on the work, trying to build a system of support for 7 schools in the Central Ward, drawing on institutions that have a long-term commitment to Newark, like the medical school, like local universities. That's right, that's right. They're working in a partnership. We want to build a partnership, provide support for schools and training. We want to get faculty from the universities working with teachers, not just in teacher education, but also in curriculum development. A colleague of mine who teaches chemistry is working with me on a chemistry project with elementary school students in the fall. So we're trying to draw on a variety of resources in that community to support these schools. And it's different from the Harlem Children's Zone in that their model is largely a service model, right? Ours is much more of an empowerment model. Right? That is, we believe that part of what it takes to break the cycle of poverty is to empower people who are poor, and particularly over generations, to take greater control over their lives, to have more control of what's happening to their children, and that's kind of built into the work we're doing as well with parents. So it's only its second 2.5 years now, so we've got a long way to go, but still at it. You come and check us out. Okay, we're back.
Hi, my name is Nisha Borman. I teach at Contra Costa College. I work in ESL. And I was just wondering if you also look at or work with community colleges, because we have a very large proportion of students who are immigrants, and especially Latino males and Latinas. And the same things that you were talking about manifest themselves at that level as well. So I'm curious to know if that is part of your work as well or not.
I think that in California, if you look at the transfer rates between community colleges to 4-year universities, if you wanted to change higher education tomorrow, just change the transfer rates. So I just think that that's an incredible resource that we're not paying attention to. And what we found in doing the Latino eligibility study, which Troy Duster was part of many years ago, he's here in the audience and he can talk more about it than I can, was that kids end up staying in the community college 4 or 5 years because nobody's telling them what to do. There's no support. It's sort of like they're just doing positive things, but they have no plan. And it's just heartbreaking because they're working these jobs and then paying for their own education, then going at night. And I think that's just a very neglected resource. And I think if we wanted to change things tomorrow, that is, to me, the revolutionary site. Community colleges, because they're already there. It's just a question of getting them over that hump of articulation and going on to four-year universities.
And I would add, one of the partners of this Newark work that is described is Essex Community College, which is the community college there in Newark. And what we're looking at, we're also, because we're looking at economic development, we're looking, how do we make sure that young people in Newark will have access to the jobs that will be growing in Newark in the future? And how can we make sure that there's educational programs to prepare them for those jobs? And we've just started that work, but we're building, we're looking into renewable energy projects, working with the public utilities, looking in the health field, where we know there are going to be jobs, but then thinking, okay, well, what has to happen differently in terms of the training that young people receive to make them eligible for those jobs when they graduate either from high school or from community college?
Can I mention one of the things I notice a lot also is for Latino males, overwhelmingly, there's a very negative academic identity that's been cemented through a lot of this idea of criminalization. And I feel that the way they've been treated for years and years of schooling, and it's very difficult sometimes, and it takes a lot of very focused work to break through that for students who are capable of achieving much more, but don't see themselves even in going in that direction.
With regard to the early independence of males, I think that's a pretty powerful statement right there, Latino males. Do you have any insights or know of any research that addresses some of the family dynamics that may produce that, or the social environmental dynamics that may produce that early independence, that may fuel that early independence?
I think that there's this very powerful ideology that women are vulnerable and have to be protected, right? And so that men are independent as soon as they pop out of the womb, and it's just like, that's true across the board, that's true for white males as well. The problem is that the macro factors are not impinging on them in the same way. So that if a white upper middle class male, including my son, is out in Oakland at 1 o'clock in the morning, he's not going to get picked up. And if he gets picked up, his dad is a lawyer and I'm there, and my sister's a lawyer. He's gonna be out of, And so the consequences are also not the same. So the independence, I think, it's a benchmark for masculinity, and so that starting at 12 and 13 years old, they become little men. They start going out. They start having no rules, and then the whole peer group has the same norms, and then independence is what men are supposed to have. Right? So there is this kind of non-reflexive socialization in all families, including my own, but the consequences are different for poor Latino families, and I think that that's the rub. And so the hypervigilance that mothers, especially mothers, confer on daughters in Latino families ends up really aiding their educational achievement. So if you have to be at home by 9, guess what? What are you going to do? Do your homework. You're gonna be well slept and rested for your morning class. But if you can come in at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and when you go to school you're sleepy, you haven't done your homework, and the ball gets rolling, right? So I think that we are just not very self-reflexive how that socialization has such incredible consequences for our young men.
And you can tell me, you're a board member in West Costa County.
Yeah, a board member in West Costa County. What effect have you seen in something called linked learning? We're one of 6 school districts who receive grants from the Irvine Foundation, where each of our high schools have academies, multimedia, art, music, health, law, and justice. And students choose it when they become sophomores, and they stay with the cluster all the way through. Is there enough evidence right now? We're seeing the students tend to stay in school. If they're really into, like yesterday, we had a ribbon cutting at Richmond High School for the Engineering Academy. Massive funding from Chevron and other groups. And the people who spoke were all Latino, young Latino men, and they explained how they were turned on by just designing things, and they showed us on the screen. And the fact that 2 of them were special ed blew people's minds apart. So any evidence about the Linked Learning, Connect, Ed reform movement in the California schools?
The qualifier always has to be that when done properly, when there's quality in these programs, I mean, I know Norton, and I know David Stern has studied these career and technical programs for years, they can be very effective, and when done right, they need not all, they can also, kids still have graduate with options, right? So it's not as though they can't go to college. They can go to college or go to work, whatever they choose. They actually have more options, because increasingly many people have to work while they're in college. So, but it's both the fact that they're getting the practical skills, but also the fact that they have community support, right? And that community support is vital to changing identities, instilling a sense of hope and possibility, all those things, those intangibles that are.
Because they stay in the same cohort all the way through until they're seniors. So the teachers have the same prep period. They know the students. They call home, constant communication, and they got the full backing of our school board.
So again, the question would be, okay, if it's working for them, why can't we do more? Right? Why don't we do more of that? Yeah, transferred out of the traditional schools into those kind of schools. Many of them are also young people who have recently been incarcerated. Right? And what we're finding, again, is in the programs that have a case management approach, right? So that is that someone actually takes time to figure out who you are, what are your needs, brokers your access, so you need a place to live, they help you get a place, okay? That is, they work with you and provide that personal connection, it works. And we're seeing, there are about almost 30 of these schools in New York City. Most of them have graduation rates of under 5%. And this is with GED, right? And then there are a couple that have 60, 70%. Well, what's different? And it's this personalized approach to support that really makes a huge difference. That's both about intentions, also about resources, right? Do you have the personnel to provide that support? But we know it works if you can do that. Right.
Yeah, this is a tough question. It comes out of your first observations and your first part. You said something like this: we can collect good data, write wonderful books, but policymakers often ignore it. And so we know policy is top down and action is bottom up. But here's the question. It's a complicated one, but you started it. Is there a way in which this kind of research can get into the hands of people who can then be mobilized, action on, and then make a connection to Arnie Duncan and to Bloomberg and others, so that there's not simply this one-dimensional bottoms-up action mobilization, but somewhere articulated the policy issues with the action issues. I mean, we're in a climate now, as everyone can see, that's possible.
Yes.
You know, I mean, Madison is simply one manifestation of it, but it's a national situation. So in that kind of a context, how do you envision this kind of penetration?
Well, you know, I don't know if I should answer any question that involves penetration. That's I love to tease these men. You know, your question makes me want to be 35 years younger, because that's the future of academia. Academia as it exists, I don't see it as being viable. I think we're all bored. You know, it's like, how many books can you write? How many articles can you write? It really is about finding new ways of applying knowledge and it being two ways, right, or multiple ways. And so it reminds me of something that actually George Lipsitz is doing in the Bay Area. And George Lipsitz, for those of you that don't know, is actually like a popular cultural theorist. And he's working on fair housing in Oakland. And he's trying to do exactly that. He's trying to get research that helps the nonprofits prove their point to the powers that be it their local politicians or the state politicians, helping them do PowerPoints, helping them write policy briefs. And by that we mean 5 pages at most, 3 pages preferably, and bullet points, and 5 things they can do now with little money. That's how you get things done, little by little, right? And then they get to know you. And then you're in their face all the time, and then you control a certain level of votes. But that we're not helping many of us that are in the academy, that's not what we do. And I think that's the next frontier, is exactly the way you articulated. How do you take all this stuff that doesn't really have any kind of major impact. It has some impact. I'm not completely in agreement with him, but it's like this instead of like this, right? And that is inefficient, and there's just too many people in pain for us to just let it happen like this. And so, but there's no natural forum or natural or models or whatever, because we have disengaged from the public realm in big numbers. I think there's exceptions, like many of the people here in the room, but you guys are the exceptions. That's not the rule. And I think that that's an issue. That's the way I see it. I see it kind of bubbling up, but it isn't quite articulated yet, and it's gonna take a real big push by a critical number of people for those models to start emerging. But you just articulated it beautifully, and that's what I see happening, or a viable model for it happening.
So I would also try to respond. I think that you're absolutely right, and so this is something I've been thinking about for a long time, right? Now, when we did research at Berkeley High several years ago on the achievement gap, one of the things we realized was research by itself was not going to lead to change, because you had to create a constituency that demanded change. And so part of what we started to do was to take the research to the parents. And lo and behold, that worked, right? That is that once the parents got the research, then they knew what to demand, right? And it became a lot more difficult for the powers that be to ignore the parents than it was to ignore some researchers. So I think you're absolutely right about that. Now, when you go beyond a school to take it to like larger levels of policy making, then it gets a lot more tricky. I've been working with a group of researchers around the country, in a group, something called the Broader and Bolder Approach, to challenge No Child Left Behind, the whole framing of No Child Left Behind, to say, look, we at least need to do universal preschool, healthcare for children, extended learning. Let's at least do that, right? And it's interesting because Arne Duncan, prior to being named secretary, signed it, saying he agreed with it. And then we couldn't get him to even talk to us while he became secretary until recently. Because if you read the Times today, now he's saying No Child Behind has to be totally revamped, which he wasn't saying even just a month ago. Now, I don't know what that means, but I had an extended conversation with Senator Bennett from Colorado on Tuesday, because he was asking, I'm here, we're working on this, give me some ideas. What should we do? So I want to think that if you're at it long enough, right, that if you're, so we've been writing op-eds, we've been doing everything we can to try doing hearings in Washington, that maybe eventually, when the time is right, we can sometimes break through.
Yeah.
I hope so. I hope so. Yes.
Yes, I appreciate your guys' presentation. I'm looking forward to reading the book. A lot of what you've said today really hits home for me personally and for family and friends. My question is, in thinking really about Latinos and this emotional capacity to either be really joyful or really angry, and then pain, particularly institutional pain that's inflicted on Latino men, does your book or any of your work upon healing in the sense of spirituality, and also thinking about faith, how do you guys think about faith communities as sort of a intermediary sort of institution or go-to with policy and research?
Let me talk. I'll just talk briefly. There's this organization called Barrios Unidos. It's in the very bottom. It's actually situated in Santa Cruz, and that's their whole model is it's sort of Aztec religion, rituals, which is very big in the joint. You know, it's like all that kind of indigenous stuff really speaks very profoundly. Sweat lodges, you know, and they have all these kind of men's groups, but it's all around being spiritual warriors. And they have developed their own sort of paradigm for how they speak, and they don't talk like it's not like women, they don't there's this kind of calmness and that they're trying to achieve so that they can stay straight. This kind of centeredness and sort of brotherhood, and I don't understand it. You know, I stand outside of it, but I do think that there has to be an articulation of men's needs and spirituality, that has to start from the ground up among men. And one of the things I've started writing about is that we need a men's movement that has to be generated to recuperate those parts of self that have been lost in the harshness of masculinity and in the brutality of how you're raised as men and the brutality that institutions do to you. And women can't do that. We've been doing that work for you, that's why you have not healed. You know, because as Angela Valenzuela's work indicates, the girlfriends are the ones that do the homework for the boyfriends in high school. They're the ones that call them up and say, are you going to school, because they oversleep. They're the ones that, you know, if you go to any courtroom, you'll see 10 little Latinitas sitting in the front waiting for their boyfriends or brothers to be processed, right? Social support. Why are we doing that? You know, that's really not a good thing. I mean, it is an emotional thing, and I certainly sure as hell did it when my brother was in there, but I'm not sure that that's a long-term solution. And so, to me, I completely agree with you. There has to be a spiritual movement of recuperation.
We have time for one more.
You want to say anything?
No, I agree. You got that one.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. First, I wanted to say thank you for this wonderful presentation. And second, I was just asking if you could maybe perhaps speak specifically to undocumented Latinos and kind of your recent findings, if there's any differences or kind of caveats of that particular community or intersections of that.
Well, several of the chapters in the book do focus specifically on undocumented. Aida Valenzuela's work focuses on the day laborers, who are almost all undocumented. The work in education also looks at that, and you know, one of the problems is the data is hard to get. People like to report that they're undocumented, and but we do know that you know, from lots of anecdotal evidence, that the undocumented status has great discouragement factor on young people about graduation, because they know that what is it going to mean if I'm not going to be able to go to college, or even if I do go to college, I'm not going to be able to get a job because of my status. So it shows up as a huge issue that it's being talked about in our communities, and it's a serious dilemma because you know, that you have families that are living in constant fear, living like fugitives, worried about being discovered. And what we're seeing now, it's interesting, just this week, Utah passed a very different kind of law in comparison to Arizona, where they're essentially going to legalize guest work is what they're calling them, right? And I'm not sure if it's been adopted yet by the state legislature, but it's interesting, in Utah, a very red state, taking a very different approach to dealing with this in the absence of leadership coming from the federal government. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out legally in terms of the legislative process. But in the meantime, we have lots and lots of families and children who are at deep risk because of the situation.
Please join me in thanking Professor Noguera. While this volume is not out yet, it'll be out in June. Routledge is the publisher. We have a number of the author's back issue outside. If folks want to buy it, they'll be in here to sign them. Please sign in to the right if you get a chance. I'd like to bring your attention to our next event, which is Sal Castro, the Chicano civil rights leader, who was the teacher who organized the 1968 walkouts in Los Angeles. Just had a new biography written of him by Mario Garcia. Both of them will be here on April 14th. There are flyers outside. I hope you'll join us and bring your friends. And the last point is exactly precisely this idea of being a bridge between academic research and the policy world is what I'm hoping this center will become. But unfortunately, because of the current budget situation, we need help. And so there's a sheet paper outside that shows ways in which you can get to the center if you are so moved in whatever amount, and I hope you will consider it so that we will have the ability to maintain these conversations like this in the future. So thank you all again. There will be a reception outside. Ideally the sun came out, so y'all please eat and enjoy the view. And thank you so much for being here.